Welcome to meeting number 120 of the House Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments through the chair. Before we hear from witnesses, I would like the committee to adopt the budget in the amount of $96,150 for the Fisheries Act statutory review. Keep in mind that we have 8 meetings on that study and a lot of people have demonstrated their interest in appearing. The travel amount for the witnesses is appropriate. Is it the will of the committee to adopt that budget? Everyone in favour? Okay, thank you for that. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on September 16, 2024, the committee is commencing a study of the impact of the reopening of the cod fishery on Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec. I'd like to welcome our witnesses from the Department of Fisheries. We have Mr. Adam Burns, Assistant Deputy Minister, Programme Sector. On Zoom, we have William McGilvery, Regional Director General, Newfoundland and Labrador Region, and Bernard Vigneault, Director General, Ecosystem Science Directorate. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Mr. Burns, I believe you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. My colleagues and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered today is the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Through generations, Indigenous peoples have been stewards of the land and the water. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes heureux d'être ici pour discuter de la
Today, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the reopening of the northern cod fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador. It is essential that we begin by noting the importance of northern cod to the economy and the culture of Newfoundland and Labrador. It is a species that is woven into the history and traditions of the province.
The groundfish fishery dominated the industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. At that time, in the province, there were close to 24,000 registered fish harvesters, as well as a significant offshore component with landings of northern cod in the range of 500,000 tons and a landed value of about $300 million. Le moratoire sur la morue a eu de profonds.
The cod moratorium had profound impacts on every aspect of life in the province, especially in coastal communities.
Industry on various initiatives, including sentinel surveys and the establishment of the stewardship fishery in 2006 in conjunction with the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Unifor. The stewardship fishery has fostered a culture of stewardship among harvesters, contributed valuable data for stock assessments, and enhanced our understanding of the resource status of northern cod. En octobre 2023, le ministère a tenu.
In October 2023, the department held a meeting of the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat to review the northern cod assessment model.
This was reached on significant improvements to the northern cod assessment model. Using this updated model, the stock was considered to be in the cautious zone of the precautionary framework. Recognizing the change in the stock status and its potential impact on management approaches, the department convened a special session of the Groundfish Advisory Committee to discuss access and allocation for a potential reopening of the northern cod commercial fishery. This session included participation by the Newfoundland and Labrador government, harvesting and processing representatives, Indigenous partners, and non-governmental organizations. En mars 2024, une évaluation complète.
In March 2024, a full stock assessment was conducted, and it confirmed that the northern cod stock remained in the cautious zone.
The Groundfish Advisory Committee to gather perspectives on the 2024 northern cod management approach. While northern cod has a unique legacy, it is subject to the department's robust consultation process before any management decisions are made. The 2024 management approach for northern cod is cautious yet optimistic. It provides for a modest increase from the roughly 13,000-ton stewardship fishery to an 18,000-ton commercial fishery in the current management plan. The decision to provide a majority allocation of over 90% of the TAC to the inshore sector and Indigenous groups reflects a commitment to those who have long been the custodians of the ocean. It also recognizes the Canadian offshore fleet's historical role in this fishery, with the majority of its northern cod allocation held by Newfoundland and Labrador interests. Their allocation supports operations that employ hundreds in coastal communities and helps establish a consistent year-round supply of cod. It is important to note that northern cod is a straddling fish stock, a portion of which is present in international waters. As a responsible fishing nation, the Department is required to consider Canada's international obligations under the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization. Canada must cooperate with other countries on the sustainable management of relevant fish stocks through participation in regional fisheries management organizations. Canada has negotiated strong conservation measures to limit catches in the NAFO regulatory area outside the Canadian 200 nautical mile limit. The Department is a key contributor to comprehensive fisheries monitoring, control, and surveillance programs in the NAFO regulatory area, and there are specific rules to protect this stock, including strict small quotas, seasonal closure, gear requirements, and minimum size. The limited NAFO allocation will be stringently monitored. Finalement, l'objectif du ministère est de travailler avec tous les partenaires.
Ultimately, the goal of the department is to work with all partners to support a modern, sustainable fishery through strong management measures and a shared desire to build and sustainably manage this stock.
And we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today to take part in this important study. Mr. Chair, my first question is to Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns, in 2015, Prime Minister Trudeau promised full access of the first 115,000 metric tons of northern cod to the inshore fleet. Is this a promise that he could keep?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening comments, over 90% of the available quota.
Could he have kept that promise? Is that a legitimate promise to make, Mr. Burns?
So in taking her decision, the minister considered a number
No, but would you consider it to be a legitimate promise, with your knowledge?
So the minister in her announcement made clear that her objective was for a year-round fishery.
No, but was the promise that was made by the Prime Minister for the first 115,000 tons, is that a legitimate promise? Is that a promise that could be kept? Based on your knowledge of NAFO commitments and whatnot, could he have kept that promise, or was it a fake promise?
So the allocation decision is one that was taken by the minister. And as was stated
but
in
the big controversy here, and from the FFAW Unifor Specialist point of view, is that the promise was made for the 115,000 metric tons. Was that a legitimate promise? Could he have kept that promise, or did he make a promise that he knew, or he should have known, that he couldn't keep?
So in her June 2024 announcement regarding her decisions related to the allocation of this year's quota, the minister laid out some specific socioeconomic considerations, including the importance of a year-round supply of fish, which is something that requires a variety of fleets to participate in. Obviously, as you know, there's not the ability to fish in the winter months, for example. And so those considerations were the elements that informed the minister's decision.
But still, could you answer that question? Could a promise of 115,000 metric tons to the inshore fleet, is it possible that that's a promise that could be kept?
I can only speak to the decisions that were taken
based
and the
on
rationale
your
that
knowledge.
was based on that. And so those decisions were based on a variety of factors, specifically the socioeconomic.
The question is, could he have kept that promise? Yes or no?
So the decision was taken by the minister.
No, that's just, could you say yes or no? Is it possible for that 115,000 ton promise to be kept?
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Morrison.
Yes, the rules of the House that are followed by this committee would lead that the questioner is harassing the witness by asking him to respond to, putting comments that the witness can clearly not address.
Mr. Bragdon on that point of order.
Mr. Chair. in no ways is that harassing the witness. We've seen far worse in committees that has taken place throughout over many years. I don't think Mr. Small has come to that level at all. He's just trying to get a clear answer from the witness. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess Mr. Burns is not going to be able to answer that question. So, Mr. Burns, you were head of Canada's delegation to NAFO last year. How high could the stewardship quota have went before the northern cod fishery would have had to become classified as a commercial fishery? Is there a figure?
The answer is no. There's no specific TAC that would have triggered something. In the NAFO measures, it was specific to the initiation of a commercial fishery. However, to have a commercial fishery on a stock that's in the cautious zone is a very standard thing, and so the risk to Canada was were the minister to have increased the stewardship fishery by a sufficient amount anyways, it was possible that other NAFO contracting parties could have perceived that as a commercial fishery and taken the matters into their own hands.
So was there any pressure placed on the Canadian delegation by NAFO to classify the fishery as a commercial fishery in those meetings?
NAFO contracting parties paid close attention to the Canadian science and Canadian management decisions. Canada worked hard to defend and continues to work hard to defend the fact that this is a Canadian-managed stock. But there was definitely consistent interest in the level of access being provided and the nature of the stewardship fishery at the time.
Thank you. Interest, but not pressure. You wouldn't classify it as pressure.
Again, I don't know what level would have triggered other contracting parties to take an action against Canada at the Commission, but I do think that were we to have increased the...
So where did the pressure come from to reclassify the stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery? What pressure were you under, Mr. Burns? What can you tell the committee about that when that decision was being made?
So as the committee will know, in the fall of 2023, a framework assessment was undertaken which enabled DFO Science to incorporate more historic data into the model. And based on that, the stock was deemed to be in the cautious zone, and it would be a typical approach to fisheries management to have a commercial fishery on a stock in the cautious zone.
So we've got court documents that tell us that minister staff stated that a commercial reopening of this fishery would be a political win. Are you familiar with that?
I can't speak to the political advice.
Did you have any dealings with the minister staff while this decision was being made?
We provide briefings to the minister and her staff related to the consultations that have been undertaken, the science process,
we understand
our policy framework.
We understand that science did not want the decision that was made. Can you confirm that?
No, I can't confirm that. I can simply refer back to the advice that the department provided to the minister, which presented a series of options for the management of this fishery.
Thank you, Mr. Burns.
We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Before I begin with my questions, I'd like to read a motion into the record for the committee, and it reads as follows. I move that the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans proceeds to the study on the statutory review of the Fisheries Act in order that we might further strengthen owner-operator rules and enforcement measures, given the Conservative Party of Canada's hidden agenda to gut owner-operator on the East Coast, much as they did in British Columbia when they were last in power. Furthermore, once the study begins, it shall not be interrupted by anything other than the scheduled ministerial appearance, hearings on wrecked and abandoned vessels, or an emergency meeting as defined by Section 1064 of the Standing Orders. Mr. Chair, at this time, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to bypass the normal 48-hour notice period and debate this motion today.
Mr. Arnold, you had your hand up.
No unanimous consent to continue this.
I'm seeking unanimous consent.
Yeah, and they're saying no, there's
No?
no unanimous consent.
Okay. There is no unanimous consent. But before I go into my questions, I think this is highlighting a bit of a hidden agenda when it comes to what I hope is not gutting the owner-operator policy, and I would ask that this motion be considered as having gone on notice. But I'll move on to my questions. Mr. Burns, some allegations have been made that the 19,000 tons is too low a number to be called a commercial fishery. I'd like to ask you, how many commercial fisheries in Canada exist that have a higher TAC than 19,000 tons? How many are lower? And can you give the committee some examples of commercial fisheries with a lower TAC? And can you table with this committee a document or spreadsheet, whatever works, that gives this committee some perspective on the sizes of Canada's various commercial fisheries and their TAC by tonnage?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I don't have a list with me today of the quotas that have been assigned, the tax that have been assigned for all of the commercial fisheries. We'd be happy to provide that. But I can speak to a couple of management plans that are certainly lower than the almost 19,000 when you consider the NAFO stock. For example, Newfoundland Capeland in NAFO divisions 2+3 for the current cycle is 14,533. Greenland halibut in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is at 2,400 tons. Northern shrimp in Area 6 off Newfoundland is 9,000. I need to put my glasses back on. 9,430. And so what I can tell the committee is there are a number of very many stocks with less than a 19,000 ton TAC.
Okay. I want to go to the next question, but it seems like when it comes to 19,000 tons, is it safe to say, like, what's the highest tonnage for a particular species? A redfish at the moment?
Redfish is off the top of my head. I wouldn't want to tell you that definitively, but certainly redfish is a much higher TAC than that, yes.
And 19,000 is, without, you mentioned you don't have the information in front of you, would be considered a rather large TAC in the context of other fisheries.
I think that's safe to say.
Okay. So, Mr. Burns, I understand that NAFO negotiations on the Northern Cod have just concluded. Can you tell this committee what sort of management measures are in place and what mechanisms are in place, quite frankly, to prevent people from breaking the rules?
Yeah, so in those negotiations, we had a few objectives. First and foremost was to defend the fact that this is a Canadian-managed stock, not a NAFO-managed stock. And so in doing that, we achieved a consensus decision where all NAFO contracting parties agreed to the Canadian rules being applied, even outside of Canada's exclusive zone. So, for example, a seasonal closure, which will also apply to the offshore inside Canadian waters from April 15th to June 30th, is implemented in the NAFO zone. Canadian gear requirements, which for cod, which had not previously been in place in other cod NAFO fisheries in 3M, are now available for use, not just in 3L, but also now in 3M, which will present other fishing opportunities for Canadian interests in the NAFO zone. The Canadian minimum size for cod, which is 43 millimeters, has been implemented in this fishery in NAFO. Previously, it was 41 millimeters within the NAFO area. And we've also implemented a measure that any vessels that do not have an observer on board, if they are found to be in violation of any of the specific flanking measures for the 3L northern cod fishery, would need to immediately return to port for inspection, which is an unprecedented aspect of the measures in NAFO. There's no other fishery that has that level of requirement.
Excellent. How much time do I have left, Mr.? Can you tell us the difference, and explain the difference to this committee and those watching, the differences between offshore trawling in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and offshore trawling of today? And what controls are in place that were not there decades ago to help regulate the fisheries such as cod?
I'm certainly not an expert on what the rules were in the 1970s related to trawling, but what I can tell you is that our current rules were, there are at-sea observers that are deployed. There are strict gear requirements. There is dockside monitoring and ongoing quota monitoring to ensure that these fishing approaches don't result in quota overruns. And all of this is predicated on a very robust scientific basis for setting the total allowable catch, which is based on robust world-class monitoring to ensure that the removals that are being authorized are sustainable, and then, as I say, all of the measures that are in place to ensure that those sustainable levels are adhered to.
Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Always appreciate your being here with us. I'm going to ask, and I insisted that Quebec be part of the discussion and our work here because it has been established that northern cod and the Gulf cod are species that are intermixed at Blanc-Sablon and in that area, and the impacts of decisions that are made regarding northern cod by the minister in this regard will certainly have an impact sooner rather than later, perhaps, on the Gulf and St. Lawrence cod species. So from that perspective, do you have specific data on the impacts of a decision to restore that fishery, whereas we're in a cautious zone? Does it have a potential impact on the cod in the St. Lawrence and in the Gulf? I'll give the floor to Bernard to answer that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the question. We think that there will be a limited impact. As you mentioned, yes, there's a certain level of interaction between the stocks of the northern cod and in those in the Gulf and St. Lawrence. And according to all of the scientific studies done, it's very limited, and it doesn't have an impact on the assessment of the stock and the management decisions taken in that regard separately. So the situation is a bit different if we look at the southern cod, south of Newfoundland. That's a stock where there is known to be a great deal of migration between contiguous stocks, because then there's research that is being done for tagging of the cod and genetic assessments as well to have a better classification of the interactions, as you've mentioned, between those two stocks. So in the case of the northern Gulf, I don't think there will be an impact, but it could be the case south of Newfoundland, and scientific work is underway. Okay, so in the study that we're concerned with, it's a limited impact or unlikely an impact, but in the south there are studies that are continuing to be carried out. When you talk about genetics, is that DNA that you're doing, that you're looking at for different fish? Yes, that's exactly. So it's management of biology and management that we're looking at. We look at the DNA profile in order to identify subpopulations, but we also look at their behavior, and we're able to follow the cod through the scientific surveys and also through the work we do tagging, and that's done through the whole offshore region. So that could be implants we put on the fish with detectors that are in the offshore areas that register the movements of the fish in the future. Or it could be tags that are physical metallic tags that we put on the fish, and once they've been fished again, we know that they've been fished first and marked, and then it gives us an idea of the distribution. Okay, tell me, according to the recent measures that you've taken, has there been an improvement on the Gulf and St. Lawrence areas? Is there a tangible or encouraging improvement? Well, for the two St. Lawrence stocks in the north and south, they are in the critical zone, so not subject to a directed commercial fishery, but their stocks, unfortunately, where the most recent surveys show that the levels are still very weak, and in both cases, unfortunately, still decreasing. We've noted that the seal, which is the major predator, is still at work, if we might put it that way, because even after so many years, the cod's not being reestablished. It's because there are predators other than fishers that are attacking them. Well, that's part of the scientific assessments. That's the conclusion we've made for the south of the Gulf. The gray seal, after the overfishing efforts were decreased, it's the gray seal really that seems to be preventing the reestablishment. It's not the case in the northern Gulf. We have work that's underway there to assess what's happening there. The gray seal is much less present in that particular zone, and until now the analysts confirm that that's not a main factor. It's more environmental issues. The cod is in very bad shape in the northern Gulf, and we think that it's because of environmental issues and mortalities rather than predators or predation. So to allow an offshore fishery now, whatever it might be, is that not risky in the context of the problems that we have with the resource? Well, it would certainly be very risky with the North and South Gulf populations. But what we're talking about here is a stock that has been improved. The levels have improved over the years. And we're now talking about the being in the cautious zone. So that is the practice, to allow a fishery with progressive steps in terms of what has happened. But this is despite the fact that it's commercial. Is it not indicative? Well, in fact, what we're doing, scientific issues, our work is focused on whether the fishery is in the critical or cautious zone. That comes from the science. And then following that, the decision to move to a cautious zone and allow the fishery is up to management. So there are rules that are established, generally speaking, that will be founded on the increase in the stock. Thank you.
We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. You know, I know I've mentioned before, I need to reiterate the implications of what it is that we're talking about today. I was born and raised in St. John's, Newfoundland, right downtown, and as a result of the cod moratorium that happened, my family picked up our entire lives and drove from St. John's, Newfoundland to Nanaimo, British Columbia, where we now call home. The decisions that are being made have real implications on the people of Newfoundland, Labrador, and quite frankly, people across Canada, because we know that all the fishing that happens benefits Canadians across the country. And so it is incredibly disappointing to see the way in which this has been handled to date. I really wish that the minister were here today to be able to ask her these exact questions and to be able to see us working together for the solutions required. We know that historic overfishing by offshore draggers was a primary factor that contributed to the collapse of northern cod in Newfoundland, and yet we're seeing decisions being made that it feels like is a endless cycle of making the same decisions. And not only that, these the overfishing that occurred, we had people in decision-making positions who allowed this to happen. And so, Mr. Burns, I'm wondering if you could please tell me if you agree with this. So we know, and we've heard it referenced many times today around the promise that was made. And I want to be really clear. The promise was that the first 115,000 metric tons of 2J 3KL northern cod quota would be allocated only to inshore and Indigenous groups before offshore corporate groups gained access. Now, that was the promise made. I know you can't speak to the decisions made by the minister. I understand that. I won't ask you to try to do that. But would you agree that based on this promise that was made over and over by the Prime Minister to people in Newfoundland and Labrador, would you agree that this promise was not met?
In the decision in June, when the minister announced her decision, her announcement at that time made note of the fact that her objective here was to ensure year-round employment stemming from the northern cod fishery, and in order to do that, there needs to be a year-round supply.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Just a note on that: employment for who? specifically?
So that is the employment related to the processing sector, so the jobs in processing plants, for example, in Arnold's Cove, as well as to the crews on offshore fishing vessels who are largely individuals living in Newfoundland and Labrador, and certainly as well in important employment and economic benefits to inshore and midshore harvesters as well.
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Burns. The promise was to allocate only to inshore and Indigenous groups. Now, you're talking about the employment of offshore corporate groups. Again, I understand what you're saying, but would you not agree that this promise was not met? Because of the fact we know that there are economic and historic reasons why the inshore fleet was supposed to be prioritized. Why? What are your thoughts as to why the minister did not follow through with this promise that was made on multiple occasions to inshore and Indigenous fishers in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Thanks, Chair. And as I've noted in the minister's announcement in June, she laid out the rationale for her decision and specifically focused on her objective of year-round economic benefits, year-round employment flowing from this fishery, and as such, the need for year-round supply.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. And through the chair, Mr. Burns, we heard the minister say in a statement to Radio Canada that, and her words were that we are revitalizing this fishery carefully. And we know what the options that you presented to the minister are. Do you think that this is, in fact, a careful approach, like she was quoting, when, in fact, it is the least careful of all the approaches that has been moving forward with by the minister?
When the department presents the minister with advice, we always present, we only present options which are viable options, and so certainly the option which the minister decided upon, we believe to be a viable option. And in fact, the science advice indicates that there is a very significant probability that the stock will remain in the cautious zone. And indeed, it is only about 1% lower probability than were the minister to have rolled over the stewardship fishery. So the difference between the commercial fishery, which is now in place, and the stewardship fishery, which was previously in place, of course, is not the full 18,000 tons. It's only a difference of 5,000 tons for Canadian harvesters. And as I note, the science advice based on that is a very, very limited difference in the, I guess you could say, the impact on the stock.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Could you please explain?
Thank you, Ms. Barron. There's only about 6 seconds left in your questioning time, so you won't get an answer if you do get a question out. We'll move on now to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just open by stating that I'm disappointed Mr. Kellaway would be spreading mistruths and disinformation. I think he ought to be better spending his time focusing on the failures of his government in the 9 years that they've been in power and delivering some of the programs he's referencing, and instead of speculating on what other parties might be into. I will start by thanking the witnesses for being here. Mr. Burns, you mentioned the 2023 CSAS process and the decision. In that decision-making process, the science advice was looked at and considered. Obviously, the stock was determined to be in the cautious zone. Was the minister made aware of the 2015 promise in the decision-making process?
Certainly, the promise you're referring to was referenced in the stock's integrated fisheries management plan. In the decision memo, which I know you've seen as well, and I have to tell you, I'm not sure if the specific reference was there, but there are a number of factors that would have been included in terms of consideration for them.
Would you not have been quite involved in that process, that decision-making process? And I'm surprised that you took a long pause to state yes or no whether the minister was aware of that 2015 promise in the decision-making process.
So it was referenced in the decision memo.
Was the minister aware?
I can't speak to what she was specifically aware of or not. I can speak to what was in the materials.
Okay. So did she decide to basically ignore that promise, or was she not aware of it?
So as I've noted in her June decision, she laid out the rationale for her allocation decision, which was focused on year-round employment and the benefits that would flow from that to Newfoundland communities. And so, you know, I can speak to that in terms of the rationale for her decision, which she has stated in the announcement of her decision.
Okay, thank you. In your earlier testimony here, you mentioned the actions that would be taken by vessels that did not have observers on board that were found to be in contravention of regulations. How would you know if a vessel was in contravention of regulations if they did not have observers on board, when we've heard that the offshore patrols have actually been, I believe, reduced by almost 50%, if not more? How would you even know if an international vessel was in contravention?
So certainly Canada plays an important role in monitoring, control, and surveillance within the NAFO regulatory area, as does the European Union. And indeed, we, from time to time, have officers from one on the other's vessels as well. What I can say, and I did consult with the Canadian Coast Guard this morning related to this, and it is anticipated that the situation with respect to Coast Guard vessel availability should stabilize for the 25 fiscal year once the Leonard Cowley returns to service upon completion of its vessel life extension work, and the Coast Guard is able to return to its historic commitment of 2 offshore patrol vessels dedicated to the NAFO program. And so we anticipate to have a very robust presence.
What does stabilize mean? Does that mean stabilized at the reduced level, or is that returning to a previous level of patrols?
So my understanding is that the Coast Guard vessels were undergoing the vessel life extension, and that is expected to be completed, and so it would be a return to the 2 vessels, which would enable a further enhancement to our presence within the NAFO regulatory area to undertake at-sea inspections.
Thank you. Before I run out of time here, you also mentioned that the minister made this decision with the goal of providing year-round employment, and yet the season was scheduled to close, I believe it was in November, but it was closed earlier. I think the announcement was Sunday, September 26th. Closed that early. That's certainly not year-round employment. Can you square that circle for us?
So I think you're referring. Sorry, Mr. Chair. I think the member's referring to the inshore fishery, and my understanding from the reporting that I've seen is that the fishery was very productive with high-quality fish and high catch rates, and so it is true that the inshore fishery did reach its quotas. There remains other quotas within
far
the
from
quotas.
year-round
Thank you,
employment.
Mr. Arnold. Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. I want to go back to, could you expand on the statement you made, robust consultation process? For somebody that wouldn't understand.
Sure, and this is a normal practice that we would undertake for any fishery, but clearly, given the unique nature of this particular potential reopening, we started with an atypical groundfish advisory committee, COD advisory committee, last fall to begin the discussion with stakeholders, which would include representatives of the FFAW, representatives of the offshore, representatives of the processing sector, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as environmental groups, and began a discussion of what their vision of a reopened commercial fishery might look like. We had further consultations once the winter science advisory process was completed and we knew what the advice would be, and so we consulted on what the tax should be, what the distribution of the quota should be.
Everybody had some sense of where this was going.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. And indeed, during those consultations, the majority of views expressed, certainly not from environmental groups, which wouldn't be expected, but from the harvesting sector, the views were very much in line with an increase in the quotas. And yeah.
Okay. You reference it's a traveling stock.
So the stock is present inside, largely, most of it present inside Canadian waters, inside Canada's 200 nautical mile limit. But some of this stock is present in NAFO Division, primarily in NAFO Division 3L.
So based on that, Mr. Burns, sorry, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Burns, how important is it that Canada participate in NAFO and be part of those decisions? What would be the impact if we simply packed our bags and went home?
So by working with NAFO, we were able to secure an international rules-based framework outside of Canada's 200 nautical mile limit, which is binding.
Is that very significant to the future of this key stock?
It is. Were we not to have...
And was it present in the past?
So NAFO certainly did have those measures in place in the past as well, but not with the same level of robust flanking measures, as we call them, related to the very specific...
So your negotiating process would lead Canada to have an agreement with more teeth in the enforcement of it?
It did, and to a very limited quota. Indeed, other than the European Union, the other contracting parties of NAFO only have access to 19 tons.
And how does that compare before, if we look...
I don't have the full quota key in front of me, but certainly it was much more significant than those quotas. The historic catches, in particular, of Russia, for example, were much higher.
Okay, so Canada was a big winner on the current negotiation that led us to where we are?
Yeah, we believe the decisions taken by NAFO defend Canada's management of the fishery and implement very robust conservation measures for those foreign fleets.
Okay, another question. Is this the same decision as before? I forget, one of my colleagues raised this, but could you outline to the committee how this decision we arrived at now compared to other decisions? Referencing stock.
So certainly, in terms of stocks that are in the cautious zone, as this stock is, it is typical for us to have a commercial fishery. The exploitation rate, the TAC level that would be established is based on the science advice and the management framework that's in place for a given stock. But certainly, it would be very atypical for us to not have a commercial fishery
Just
on a stock.
in my final time, Mr. Burns, how important is the way the decision made for year-round supply generating the maximum employment in Newfoundland?
So currently, in order for example, the plant in Arnold's Cove to operate year-round, there is a requirement to have foreign fish, frozen fish, brought in order to enable year-round activity. So the result of having a year-round supply of Canadian caught fish will result in higher quality, lower costs, and increased access to product and thus employment.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We'll now go on to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I only have 2.5 minutes, but I'm going into a broader question. The people on the front lines are worried. Scientists outside of the DFO are worried. I think some DFO scientists are worried. People are talking about being alarmed and an historic error being committed. We're closing the pelagic fisheries in Quebec. No more shrimp. We've opened the redfish fishery too late. And now, all of a sudden, on the basis of wanting to supposedly protect the whole ecosystem, all of a sudden there's a kind of illogical decision being taken here to reopen this fishery, according to the comments that we've heard. So how do you explain this, that DFO sometimes changes its deeply held values? Is this an issue of always looking at applied science, Or might there be sometimes some insistence on behalf of the minister so that decisions perhaps might be taken in favor of one group rather than another? Is it always based on the same principles? Yes. For the past 15 years, we have established sustainability policies to inform the management decisions for these stocks. Clearly, the fishing of pelagic stocks would require a very early decision to ensure that those stocks are protected. Insofar as the decision regarding northern cod is concerned, it's the result of a revision of the model that was accepted last fall, and we're now able to include data that goes back to the 1950s. And with that increase in the data within the model and that revision of the model, we are now able to see that the stock is in the cautious zone, the orange zone, as we call it. And with that information, the minister decided to reopen the commercial fishery with a very small increase in the TAC from 13,000 to 18,000 tons for Canada. And that results in a very, very small difference in the risk to the stock compared to the stewardship fishery.
This is not very long. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Burns, I actually wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the question that you were just responding to, Madame Desbiens, about. Specifically, I don't understand. I know that there was a change in the model for the northern cod stock that led to this determination that northern cod has been in the cautious zone since 2016 instead of the critical zone. I heard you reference the fact that the data being used goes back now to 1954 instead of 1983 is the number I have here. How does adding 30 years of data from 1954 to 1983, almost 30 years, how does that help us to understand the stock today and the decisions required on how to best move forward to protect the stock and ensure economic viability for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians?
Mr. Chair, I'll ask my colleague Bernard to answer that question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we now have, with the research that was done and the monitoring that was done over the year, we have a very robust new model to not only make projection for the next few years in terms of the biomass of the stock, but also to each time there's new data in a year, re-estimate the historical biomass along the entire period. And previously, we were using just limited data from our survey. With the additional science that was done, we had access to much larger data sets up to the 50s.
Thank you, Monsieur Vignon. If I can just clarify, just because I don't have a lot of time, how does adding data from 1954 help us today? This is what I'm not understanding. We're in very different circumstances with the climate crisis, with dwindling stocks. We have the overfishing that has occurred that we're still recovering from. How does that data help us to make sound decisions today?
So the added data help us better understand the potential for the cod to reproduce, and we now know that they can recover, they can reproduce at a lower level than historically estimate. The new model also takes count of an environmental factor, including the availability of capelin for the stock. So that's another benefit of the new model that was adopted last fall.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, my question to Mr. Burns, based on a statement that he said that the stewardship fishery provided valuable data, his colleague, Monsieur Vignon, had just said that he only had data from surveys. Something's not adding up, Mr. Chair, with this, and then they're using data that goes back to 1954. So, Mr. Burns, When did you analyze the logbook data from the stewardship fishery from 2020, 21, and 1922? Or sorry, 2022?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Yeah, I simplified too much things. Yeah, there's a large sets of data that goes in addition to the survey, including.
You said you only had the survey data.
That was the main basis of the model.
So when was the logbook data from 2020, 2021, and 2022?
They were assessed in the last stock assessment in March 2024.
So it was valuable data that you collected since 2006. But in my order paper question last fall, which I received an answer back to, I received it in December, that those 3 years of logbook data that were provided from the stewardship fishery had not been looked at. So if it's valuable, if it's so valuable, why was it sitting there, not analyzed, for 3 years when it could have led to economic opportunity for fishermen in Newfoundland and Labrador?
I'm not aware of the detail. I know there was issues with COVID and the transmission, but as I mentioned in the last stock assessment, they were analyzed along with the data that comes from
But if that data was valuable, and the stewardship fishery was so important for providing valuable data, as Mr. Burns had stated, why did it take 4 years to analyze 2020 logbook data?
Again,
why would it take so long to analyze valuable data?
The data was analyzed recently along with the Sentinel survey. As you recall, there has been some issues with the transition of vessels, so there was no stock assessment done in 2022 and 2023. In the latest stock assessment, the logbook were used.
But the data is analyzed in offices in 200 Kent and in the White Hills, not on the vessels that were out of commission. Why was the data not analyzed sooner? And if it was analyzed at all, what was the catch rates that were being? What catch rates were being? What was the story of the catch rates that you got from that data?
Yeah, no, and exactly as you said, the catch rates trends are looked at every stock assessment, and they inform the analysis of the data, and that is part of the science advice that was published. I don't know if my colleague, Mr. McGilligan, has additional information on the logbook information analysis in Newfoundland.
I don't have anything to end up on now.
Thank you. I've got a question. It's a specific question about an area on the Newfoundland coast from Cape Bald to Cape Norman, where the cod fishery was shut down in 1992. It's a part of 4R which remained open until 93, but scientifically that part of the stock was considered to be northern cod. Now, with the stewardship fishery and now this commercial fishery, harvesters that have home ports between Cape Norman and Cape Ball aren't allowed to fish in that area. They have to go outside into a certain part of 3K. Why can't they fish in that area between Cape Norman and Cape Bald if that's an area that science has identified that stock is northern cod? Why aren't they allowed to fish that area? Why are they being pushed outside and actually driving their carbon footprint way up and having to do so?
Mr. Chair, I'll ask my colleague, Mr. McGilvery, to respond to that question.
You're on mute.
After all these years, sorry, Mr. Chair. This is in reference to what we call the 3K equivalent fleet that, as you said, are between Cape Bald and that location. It's about 34 license holders from Newfoundland Labrador at the present time on our conservation harvesting plan. They do have access to fish, and they fish in 3K. So they're fishing northern cod in 3K. These conservation harvesting plans are done collaboratively also with FFAW and negotiations with them. So if that would be to change, would have to have conversations with them in the way forward.
Thank you for that,
We
Mr. Small.
negotiate those plans every year.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go on to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regardless, any of the witnesses could answer this question. You talked about some companies, offshore companies, in the beginning. There are some in my area here that will be able to launch a cod fishery with the new allocation they've just received. So could you repeat the names of some of those companies that will be able to use this new access for the cod fishery? Some examples? Okay, for example, Ocean.
Would have access to northern cod.
Parfait.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. For Inshore International, we're talking about approximately how many employees that these big companies employ. Well, it would be hundreds of employees. I don't have specific numbers here, but I think they will be witnesses here over the next few weeks, and they will be able to give you specific data. And we're talking about what percentage, again, just so that it's clear, that these offshore companies have received in terms of the new allocation. What is the percentage? It's 6% of the Canadian quota. 6% of 18,000 tons, so that's 2,000 tons. So the same companies, Mr. Burns, before the cod fishery, we had the moratorium in '92, they probably have benefited from cod allocations at the time. But since the fishery was closed, what have those companies been doing? Were they fishing for other fish, other resources? What were they doing? Well, it's exactly that. They have quotas for other fisheries, for ground fish, and several of those companies also have northern shrimp quotas. And, of course, they also have domestic quotas in other NAFO zones. So each of them have established a combination of different quotas. So those big companies, even if they didn't have any cod to process for 30 to 40 years, some of those companies are even publicly traded, you have to think that they've done well for themselves. Yes, that's true. And as I said earlier, for example, the processing plant at North's Cove and other plants have, from time to time, had to buy foreign fish in order to have some work throughout the whole year. Okay, so if those companies were so successful over all those years, for example, in terms of this new redfish allocation, if I have time, I'll talk about it later, but if they've all been successful throughout the codfish moratorium, why give them 6% of the quota? Why give it to fleets that don't need it? And was that one of the recommendations that you made? Because when I was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Fisheries, there were often 3 or 4 scenarios, and the minister was able to choose from them. So those are options that you, as officials, were proposing to the minister so that she could make a decision. So did you recommend to her to give 6% to the offshore, or was that part of her recommendation? Well, the minister's decision was based on the goal or objective of having employment throughout the year. Therefore, it's necessary to have an offshore fleet that's able to fish during the winter months, for example. Therefore, that's the reason why the minister took that decision, as she explained. in handing down her decision and her announcement in June. It's just, Mr. Burns, every time that you and your colleagues talk about protecting the resources and the ocean, and now all of a sudden we're starting to give quotas to huge corporations, like the redfish fishery, for example. There's a huge percentage that they're going to get. So Mr. Romeo Leblanc was saying this in the 1970s. He was on the side of Canadian fishers. He said that foreigners and big offshore companies that overfish were responsible for the decline in stocks. And so with that logic, he expanded Canada's economic zone to 200 kilometers. And he said, in other words, it means that we have taken the future of our fisheries in hand. 10 years later, 5 years after the declaration of the cod moratorium, Mr. Romeo Leblanc, now a senator, said he couldn't understand that decision. He said that these people are ones who just want to empty our oceans. So when I look at this decision now, Mr. Burns, I know as government that we are responsible, but you as officials are giving a recommendation to the minister to allocate those percentages to offshore fleets, which in my opinion they have less need for and compared to the inshore fisheries. So we are talking about protecting the biodiversity of the oceans, and if we're giving 60% of the redfish allocation to foreign companies who have continued to fish and decimate these stocks. So is it normal that we're still giving these huge percentages to big corporations in a time when we're talking about protecting the ocean and protecting biodiversity in the oceans?
To Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Burns, I'll carry on with the year-round employment message that you say the minister was focused on as part of her decision that she wanted to work towards year-round employment. What time frame did the stewardship fishery operate under? How many weeks or months?
So in terms of the specific length in any given year, I can ask my colleague to speak to that, but I can tell you that it was primarily a summer fishery.
How many weeks or months?
I'll turn to Mr. McGilvery, who would have the specific details year by year.
I don't have the specific dates in front of me, but I would say it's about 11 weeks, from 11 to 15 weeks, a normal fishery season for the inshore.
Would the normal closing date be?
This year was in November. It depends on 2J and 3KL. Usually after when it comes to late October, November, weather comes really into play. So there's a lot less activity on the water, and basically the few are left to fish the remaining fish.
The closure was announced on September 27th this year to close on September 29th instead of November 16th, almost 2 months prior to the potential planned closure. Would you say that that is adding to year-round employment, or is that counter to the minister's objectives?
Well, currently I'm sorry, go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to say that the offshore conservation harvest plan is just being finalized, or perhaps is finalized today. We're sort of in that time zone. In addition to that, the two Indigenous allocations and the special allocation for the new Natukuva Community Council remain available as well. And so while the inshore fishery has closed...
That's not answering my question of, was the almost 2 month shorter season a goal, or reaching the goal of providing year-round employment, as you stated, was the minister's one of her key pieces in her decision?
And so, Mr. Chair, it is typical for the inshore sector to complete in sort of this time frame into November, and what will be able to occur this year is that the offshore
this time frame is now mid-October. This was shut down late September, weeks earlier. than the mid-October. It's certainly not year-round employment for the harvesters,
And we
probably for the plant workers.
And we anticipate that the offshore sector will begin fishing in the near term, as well as the potential for those indigenous and special allocations to be harvested over the coming weeks and months.
And it's been anecdotally stated that the offshore sector could be completed in as little as 2 weeks with the catch rates and the potential of some of these harvesters. How does that add to year-round employment through this fishery?
By having the offshore sector able to harvest quota, there will be the availability of fish at other points in the year. For example, in the winter months when the offshore sector would be able to harvest. I know that they'll be looking at their harvest plans and determining when is most appropriate to make those efforts. Obviously, it's been a long time since they've been fishing in these areas, so there will be a certain amount of learning that they will need to undertake over the coming weeks and months in order to maximize those benefits.
Okay, I want to switch topics a little bit here. The House Common Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans report on management of pinnipeds from 2024 observed the impacts of seals and their impact on capelin that cod also prey on. What is the current assessment of the capelin stock? Do you even know? And what is the impact on the capelin stock by pinnipeds in Atlantic Canada and the territory of the northern cod?
Mr. Chair, I'll ask my colleague Bernard Vigneault to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yeah, capelin is critical for the health of the northern cod stock in terms of the stock status. So if you're referring to the 2J, 3KL, the Newfoundland cod is in the above the critical, so it's in the cautious zone, and it's been assessed annually. We're looking at, for a species like capelin, there's predation is important, as you know, by seal, but also by all sorts of other fish, other marine mammals, whales, and as well as marine seabird. So we don't have we don't think that the seal predation per se is the main factor for the capelin stock. When the model that we've developed looks at more other environmental factor, the timing of the ice, for example, which has proved very important in terms of the growth of the capelin. And the capelin is another example of a stock where we establish an environmental approach for management. So the new limit reference point that we've established was developed in correlation with the northern cod, so that we have sufficient, there's a level of capelin in the ecosystem that's sufficient for the growth of cod and the other predators in the marine ecosystem that relies on capelin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions around the table are for Mr. Burns, and we hear a lot about historical attachment when folks talk about fishery decisions, lobbying around fisheries decisions. And just from your perspective, did the offshore fleet in Newfoundland and Labrador have a historical attachment to the fishery? And is it fair to say when people ask that historical arrangements be respected, that also includes offshore fleets?
It is true for sure that the offshore sector had quotas in the northern cod fishery. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chair, at this time, I'd like to table for the committee's record 3 letters from the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, which ask the Minister to consider the interests of the offshore fleet in reopening the northern cod fishery. These documents are already public and have been referenced by the FFAW in their own press releases. The committee will find them, I think, very helpful in writing their own report and while considering the question of advice the Minister received on this matter. Furthermore, Mr. Chair, at this time, I'd like to table 2 other documents for the committee. First is a letter from MP Small to the Minister dated May 9th, in which Mr. Small lobbies for the inclusion of the offshore fleet into the northern cod fishery via a reference to the interests of the Atlantic Groundfish Council, which of course represents the interests of the offshore fleet. Additionally, Mr. Chair, I am tabling a personal email from Mr. Small sent to Minister Lebatilier, in which he again lobbies for the offshore fleet's access to the fishery, not just by referencing the matter of historical attachment, but also the fact that he included a copy to a representative of the offshore fleet, and no one from the inshore fleet was included in that email. Also, there's reference to...
Chair? I think that Mr. Kellaway is not putting out the full facts there.
Okay,
I'd like to continue, Mr. Chair, if that's possible. Also, there's reference from MP Small on it's not unreasonable for the minister to ignore DFO science on cod. It's clear to me, on our side of the room, Mr. Chair, that Mr. Small, on behalf of his leader, Mr. Polyev, was lobbying for interests of the offshore fleet directly to the minister, while he thought the inshore fleet wasn't looking before it became politically advantageous for him and his boss to take the other side. I think with this evidence before the committee, the minister was hearing from both the province and, indeed, the official opposition that the offshore fleet's access to the fishery was very important. I would also note that our side will be sending this material via press release within a few minutes as well, Mr. Chair. Do I have time to... How much time do I have?
You've got 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Excellent. Mr. Chair, I want to go back to the quota breakdown, because I think a lot of times, both in the media and actually around this table, in fact, there isn't a clear breakdown of the quota. So I want to recite what I believe is the quota breakdown. And that is the 84% of the quota goes to inshore, correct?
Yes.
10% to Indigenous harvesters. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
6% goes to the offshore fleet. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So when we talk the offshore fleet, and it's been talked around here, can you talk about some of the Canadian companies, the men and women that are on those vessels that work in Newfoundland and Labrador, the men and women who work at processing plants? Can you talk to the level of Canadian, level of Canadian input, Canadian identity related to those particular offshore companies?
Thanks, Chair. And I did just want to note, earlier I indicated that the Indigenous allocations were all still available, and indeed the Nunatsiavut government Indigenous allocation is currently being fished by inshore fixed gear vessels from 3KL. In terms of Canadian companies, the companies in question are all required to be majority Canadian owned. And the companies themselves have indicated that either entirely or nearly entirely they are staffed and crewed by Canadians who are from local communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, largely in terms of this particular fishery.
How much time, Mr. Chair?
22 seconds.
So when we talked earlier about offshore, and we talked about the 6%, we talked about the historical connection, and I would put it out there that 6% in relation to historical attachment and the impact of offshore to the men and women in Newfoundland and Labrador, well, that's 6%. I wasn't the best at math, but boy, oh boy, 6% seems to be a good number to keep jobs in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm tempted to go along in the same lines as my colleague, Mr. Cormier. I imagine that pelagic fisheries and the shrimp fishers are wondering why offshore boats are getting back to the fishery and using those techniques and scraping up a part of the resource. Some 10 years ago, and today rather than giving some lift to the regional economy, we're putting these boats back out on the waters, and we know what the repercussions are of their kind of fishing. So what explains this tangibly? How can you explain you at DFO that kind of decision today. If you talk to the mackerel fishermen and others who have transformed their boats so that they could fish redfish because they didn't have big enough quotas, the cod fishermen got compensation at the time, but the victims of closures now don't have that. So what are you telling these people today? Well, as far as management of the offshore fleet is concerned, I can say to the committee that we have very strict measures in place to ensure that their catch is in line with the quota. And we have several rules concerning fishing gear used, etc., to ensure that the rules are followed and that their fishery is just sustainable. Do you think that's really safe enough? Well, yes, we've put forth several rules for the northern cod fishery. And the fishing plan that's in place for the offshore fleet has several components dealing with the sustainability of the fishery. When the minister tells us that she wants to protect the resource for future generations and that she's taking into account the livelihood of people on the water and the fishermen, and looking at her decision, do you really think that her decisions are enlightened by what's happening on the front lines or for other reasons? Well, the government or the department has undertaken several consultations with all of the fleets involved, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, environmental groups as well, and for all of these perspectives and points of view were sent to the minister. They've all been incorporated in the opinions formed by the department, and therefore we had a very good overview of all of the perspectives involved, the industry, environmental groups, the government of Newfoundland, and establishing our analysis in order to inform the minister's decision.
2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still reflecting on the new information that's going to be tabled, and I look forward to reviewing those documents. I will say, it just really highlights to me the continued, sorry to say it, but consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments that continue to corporatize public resources at the detriment of local people in communities like Newfoundland and Labrador. So I will be reviewing that information and taking it from there, and I appreciate that being tabled along with any other information of further corporatization, which is exactly the theme of what it is that we're talking about today at the detriment of the good people of Newfoundland and Labrador. With that, I have not enough time, and so I wanted to talk about transparency, if I could, through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Burns. If we could please, if you could share a little bit. We know in 2017, prior to me becoming a member of Parliament, there was a report that was tabled. Point is it talked about the importance of transparency, in particular on stock status, reference points, and management measures, and that this be included in the annual sustainability survey for fisheries. Now, I'm not seeing that transparency in this decision being made available. Can you speak to how this process was transparent, where this information is available to the public to clearly understand the decision-making process, and if it will be included in that annual survey that's being referenced from 2017, Newfoundland and Labrador's northern cod fishery charting a new sustainable future? Thank you.
Certainly, the department undertook a number of concrete actions related to that report and those recommendations. I can say that in the case of the process that was undertaken since last fall, flowing from the framework assessment that occurred in the fall, which indicated that the northern cod stock may be in the cautious zone, the department did immediately hold, or very quickly held, a special advisory committee meeting to begin the discussions that would help inform the potential reopening of this fishery. Certainly following the CSAS advice in the winter, a subsequent advisory committee meeting was held where the full suite of the science advice that was available was presented, and broad and open discussions were held, as I mentioned, with the FFAW and inshore harvesting interests, the offshore sector, environmental groups, the province, in order to well inform this decision. And as I noted in the minister's announcement in June related to the reopening of this fishery, she did lay out the basis for her decision that led to the decision that she did take.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Mr. Kellaway's point, Mr. Chair, I'll make no bones about it that I wrote the minister several times in support of the livelihoods of harvesters in Newfoundland and Labrador, and to support a lot bigger quota increase than what they got, but not to change the fishery from a stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery. Mr. Chair, as you know, it was the other side of the House, it was the Liberals who lobbied to have that fishery reopened as a commercial fishery because it would be a political win. I wasn't looking for a win in politics in terms of what would be happening with the northern cod fishery. Mr. Chair, I was looking for a win for our harvesters and our plant workers and our coastal communities that depend on it so much. So back to Mr. Burns, to that statement about how the minister was seeking year-round employment in the fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador by this mere increase of basically 3,000 tons or 5,000 tons. So basically, I guess we could say that the 3KL portion was caught in about a dozen fishing days. Mr. Vigneault or Mr. McGilvery, they fished about a dozen days altogether because they only fished about 2 days a week. And then a vessel like the Calvert with 6% of and the share as well that's shared by ice water. That 6% can be fished in less than a couple of weeks. So you're talking about altogether less than 30 days of harvesting by a fraction of the people involved in the industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. How's that add up to year-round employment?
Certainly, at the current quotas, Mr. Chair, as the member indicated, the total number of harvesting days necessary to harvest that are limited. Certainly, our view is that we've put in place a management regime that is sustainable. And that will hopefully result in a further increasing in the biomass and enable increases in the total quota in the coming years, which will over time increase obviously the number of harvesting days and enable even greater removals throughout the course of the year.
So getting back to the first round of questioning here, I never did get an answer from yourself, Mr. Burns. The Prime Minister made a pretty big promise back in 2015. Was that a promise that he could have kept?
So again, it's the Minister of Fisheries who makes the decisions related to the management of the fishery pursuant to the Fisheries Act. And in her decision, she did, as I've noted in her June announcement, indicated that the reason she took the allocation decisions she did, including providing the vast majority to the inshore, was, however, to have some access to other fleets, recognizing that foreign offshore vessels would also be fishing outside of Canada's 200 miles, and wanting to ensure that there would be ongoing employment. Year-round employment.
If you were Prime Minister, with your knowledge of northern cod and commitments that are already in place with that, if you were the Prime Minister, would you have made that promise for 115,000 tons? to the inshore fleet? Would you have made that promise if you were Prime Minister?
Again, the Fisheries Act gives that decision-making authority to the Minister of Fisheries, and she did indeed indicate the basis for the decision that she took.
So the promise that was made without authority, is what you're saying?
I can't speak to that, to a political promise, but what I can say is that the minister's decision was based on an objective of having a robust fishery in the years to come as well, that would generate year-round employment and economic benefits.
Mr. Chair, it seems that Mr. Burns can't answer that question, so I'd like to move that the committee call the minister to come in and answer that question. If that 115,000 tons was a legitimate promise that could have been kept, Mr. Chair.
She's coming? She is. Oh, okay. Yep, thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less. That was the quickest response I ever see.
Thank you, Chair. Now that it has become abundantly clear that the official opposition critic was lobbying for the offshore while pretending to support the inshore, my question then would go to, could you explain to me what an impact would be if Canada didn't arrive at a mutually agreeable decision with NAFO?
So certainly it is NAFO under international law that has jurisdiction for the waters outside of Canada's exclusive economic zone.
The fish species we're talking about is a traveling stock. So if there's no mutual management of that resource as it moves off, how does that impact the inshore?
Were NAFO to have not adopted the measures that it did this year, or to have undertaken an approach to set quotas outside of Canada's management plan, it could have posed a conservation risk and could have undermined the Canadian management of this stock and Canada's ability to defend Canada's share of this fishery.
I believe history would show that a lot of the fishing that resulted in the collapse of the East Coast cod fishery occurred offshore.
Certainly, it's our view that it's very important to have robust conservation measures in place outside of the Twin
So if we're going to have a robust inshore fishery for the benefit of the inshore fishers, then it's important that Canada be an active partner in international organizations like NAFO?
It is a single stock, and so inshore abundance moves further offshore at various points in the year, and so it is important, again, to have that robust management regime in the NAFO regulatory area as well.
And the Newfoundland fishery, by definition, has always consisted of a robust inshore as well as a robust offshore?
Historically, Mr. Chair, yes, that is.
Yes,
that is
unlike true. Other maritime provinces, but Newfoundland has been its fishery has been heavily tied to exploiting the resource offshore.
There are very productive fishing grounds in the offshore areas off Newfoundland and Labrador.
And the benefit accrues back to Newfoundland.
Largely, the Canadian fleets that are fishing in those waters are from Newfoundland. Certainly, there are some from Nova Scotia as well, but yes.
And again, you pointed out earlier, most of those vessels are crewed by people from Newfoundland.
That's correct, yes.
And they supply the plants on land in Newfoundland that are staffed by residents of Newfoundland?
Correct.
So in any mismanagement of the overall resource would have a direct impact on not only the offshore but the inshore.
Yeah, that's correct. And we do think that we have a robust regime now in place.
Right. So could you describe who is fishing the Canadian share of the offshore?
So, the ultimate entities that will fish will depend. There are rules available to offshore companies to transfer quotas amongst themselves based on their own individual corporate harvesting plans.
Have those been part of the management of fishery for some time?
That's a standard approach that's used for all of the groundfish fisheries.
When you say a standard approach, expand.
So the enterprise allocation approach that exists amongst the offshore groundfish harvesters is such that there's regular and ongoing quota trades between license holders in order to enable maximum efficiency in terms of economic output of the fishery.
To apologize, if the minister hadn't have allocated, which is a small allocation to the offshore, how would have that impacted back in Canada?
Well, given the stock is in the cautious zone, it's very likely that NAFO would have taken a decision to reopen a fishery.
So if the minister were clear on the record, if the minister didn't allocate the offshore, NAFO would have used that to increase their allocation?
That is possible, and it would have had foreign vessels fishing in the NAFO zone without Canadian vessels present.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to carry on a little bit more on Mr. Morrissey's questions. You state that had Canada not provided the offshore opportunity, that NAFO could have. Had NAFO made any efforts to encourage Canada to open an offshore fishery?
So NAFO paid close attention over the last several years, since 2006, to the stewardship fishery, and every year asked both questions around the management approach that was in place, as well as to look at the Canadian science advice. We were very strong at the NAFO table to ensure we defended the fact that this was indeed a Canadian managed fishery, but NAFO paid close attention to how we were managing this.
Had they indicated that they would be looking for an offshore NAFO fishery?
Certainly, as soon as science advice came out that showed that the stock was in the cautious zone, there was increased interest from NAFO contracting parties. That occurred after the last annual meeting, and so there wasn't a meeting in which such pressure occurred specifically.
So there's no official record of any NAFO request for an offshore fishery? This is just all off-the-record requests?
So the NAFO measure that was in place indicated that once there was a commercial fishery in Canada, the fishery would open within the NAFO regulatory area, and it specified some high-level quota distribution.
If it had remained a stewardship fishery, NAFO would have had no claim to an offshore fishery?
It would have been very unusual for there to not be a commercial fishery on a stock in the cautious zone, and so NAFO has jurisdiction over the waters outside of Canada's 200-mile limit and could have taken a decision to reopen that fishery in the absence of...
You say could have, but they had given no official indication that they would move in that direction. Is that correct?
So NAFO itself...
Is that correct?
Well, I need to explain that NAFO itself is an organization that is made up of 13 contracting parties. So NAFO as an entity wouldn't have that kind of perspective. It would be a decision taken by the 13 contracting parties. And indeed, the European Union did seek to intercessionally, so outside of a regular meeting, to move a motion by email vote to reopen the commercial fishery in NAFO over the course of the summer. Canada was successful at having them withdraw that motion, so it could be discussed more completely at the annual meeting.
I'd like through the chair to request records indicating that there was that NAFO pressure, because from information we had, there was no formal request from NAFO for an offshore fishery. So through the chair to you, Mr. Burns, that information of pressure from NAFO be provided to the committee in time for this report. Thank you. Changing topics again a little bit, can you give us an indication, this may go to Mr. McGilvery, I'm not sure, of the number of jobs per ton harvested in the inshore fishery versus the offshore fishery, or the Canadian inshore fishery versus the NAFO fishery? How many jobs per ton?
I'll pass that to Mr. McGilvery. I think the question was to him, Mr. Chair.
I don't have that information with me on jobs per ton. I will say that there's about, from an inshore fishery, there's about 1,654 license holders right now for this year.
That would, to me, would be an important economic decision and a very important factor in determining year-round employment. If you don't know how many jobs per ton are being harvested by each sector, it seems to me the department or the minister has failed to be provided with an important piece in the decision-making process. If NAFO had taken actions that could have impacted Canada's management of the northern cod stock, what would have been the impacts of that NAFO action?
Mr. Chair, it's always difficult to answer sort of a hypothetical question, but what I can say is that NAFO has jurisdiction for the waters outside of Canada's 200 nautical mile limit. So had we been offside of NAFO, as it were, NAFO would have the authority to establish various management measures and to establish a total allowable catch for other NAFO
you don't know the
contracting
potential
parties.
impacts then. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Arnold, your time is up. We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it was mentioned earlier about the corporatization of the fishery. And I just wanted to highlight that, it was the Liberal Party that enshrined owner-operator into law, into the Fisheries Act, and it's something that we seem to want to avoid, actually reopening the Fisheries Act and studying it here, which is a real disappointment for myself and the folks where I live. But I want to look at the offshore just a bit. And, we've talked about, how this may damage the environment. So I'm just wondering, can you tell us the areas where offshore will be fishing? And, what kind of technology is used today as compared to 1973 or 1984 or so forth? Like, where are we today when it comes to offshore compared to those times that oftentimes we're comparing decades to decades?
So certainly the offshore sector is obviously fishing in a different zone than the inshore would. For the Canadian offshore sector, it would be able to fish in offshore zones in 2J, 3K, and 3L. The NAFO fleets, other NAFO contracting parties, will only be able to fish outside of 200 miles in Area 3L specifically. In terms of other measures that are in place, we have a very robust at-sea observer program, dockside monitoring, gear requirements, mesh size, and those sorts of things that ensure that, for example, small fish are not being caught. Canada has a minimum size of 43 millimeters for cod, which is larger than what NAFO's previous minimum size was, and Canada was successful at having that changed for 3L cod this fall at the meeting. We'll also have a seasonal closure that will be in place from April 15th to June 30th to help protect potential spawning activity. And so there's a number of measures that we've put in place that ensure that the fishing activity itself is done in a way that mitigates the risk, but also that is monitored to ensure that the quotas available are respected and not exceeded.
So in 2016, northern cod moved out of the critical zone and into the cautious zone. We found out earlier this year, that is. Are there any other fish that are in the cautious zone where we have a stewardship fishery instead of a commercial fishery?
Not that I'm aware of. My view is that the stewardship fishery was a unique fishery specific to the northern cod fishery.
Okay. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes. Don't need these. One of the key elements there's a lot of interesting testimony here today, very interesting and compelling. But one of the ones I want to go back to around the economic benefits with respect to the offshore, and we talked about the season, and we talked about the potential for continuing the fishery in the winter months, and when we look at the number of people employed, I think you touched upon this in terms of you have to find more data, but do we have just a general idea of how much employment this will create or sustain in terms of the offshore? And I'm also wondering, do we have numbers for the inshore as well? Because, my God, they're absolutely the heartbeat and the lifeblood of the fishery, not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, but in Atlantic Canada, I dare say, across the country. So do we have, stats in terms of the employment from inshore to offshore that are Canadian?
So this year's management decision did increase the available quota to the inshore sector as well, and so that will have an economic benefit to the inshore sector. There are certainly hundreds of jobs associated with the offshore fishery as well as with the processing sector, which will also benefit. From the decision and the commercial fish, the year-round commercial fishery.
So we don't have specific, hard data per se. We have general ideas of the employment it creates, say, on the west side of Newfoundland and Labrador and the east side of Newfoundland and Labrador. We have general ideas at this moment in terms of how that would maintain and perhaps create new economic opportunities.
I mean, we can provide the committee with the number of inshore groundfish license holders and the number who were active this year. There may be some data lag in terms of the number of active harvesters for this year. In terms of the employment levels in processing plants, that's not direct jurisdiction for DFO, so we don't have specific data on exact numbers related to the processing sector.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like you to give me an overview of the anticipated impacts that will happen with this commercial fishery versus the stewardship fishery. So those are two different approaches that don't cover the same interests. And I'd like you to speak about the impact following these decisions. Well, the biggest difference is the inclusion of other participants in the fishery, whether it is the allocations for Indigenous groups or special allocations, and also, of course, the offshore participation. So the management measures and the protective measures taken concerning the sustainability of the stock are still in place, and in fact have been augmented as far as the offshore fleet is concerned. So the difference between protecting the stock, and there is no difference. The management measures continue to protect the stock, and the risk with the increase of the TAC by 5,000 tons really represents almost no difference to the stock by comparison to the 13,000-ton TAC. Well, in terms of the stocks, okay, but the techniques used by the offshore fleet, they certainly caused a fluctuation in the expected results, no? Well, we have zones that are closed in order to protect the ocean and to protect vulnerable species, but we also have measures in place in order to ensure that the catches are well taken into account and that the TAC numbers are followed. And so we have several measures in place to ensure that the offshore fleet, well, the costs.
Get a question.
So I'm sorry. Usually I put my timer on.
We'll go to Ms. Barron now for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Burns. Wondering if you can share a little bit around, we know, so regarding the probability that stocks will dip back into the critical zone, and the department will, in fact, have to walk back on this decision. Do you have through the Chair, do you have a rough estimate, Mr. Burns, of the percentage of the risk that this may occur?
Yeah, so as I noted, the difference in the risk to the stock versus, so between a rollover, if you were, of a stewardship fishery at 13,000 and the management plan that the minister has put in place, there's almost no difference. It's a 1% difference between those two. And so the net effect is essentially the same in terms of the risk tolerance for this decision, which is certainly consistent with the fish stock provisions in the Fisheries Act.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Just a question that's related but not related to my previous one quickly. Can you confirm that the decision will not negatively impact the ability of northern cod to reach a healthy population level? Is this something that you can reassure Newfoundlanders and people across Canada?
My colleague Bernard Vigneault, Mr. Chair, will speak.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Just for the record, it's a 2% difference, but same point. It's not very significant. And yes, the issue for the probability of growth is that even with no fishing, including the stewardship fishery, there's a fairly high probability of decline. So that's why the additional probability difference with the increased fisheries are not much significant. Again, we're talking about the 2% difference between the probability with the stewardship fishery or with the TAC that was announced.
I didn't set my timer, Mr. Chair, but I'm assuming I'm out of time.
You got 20 seconds.
Oh, well, look at that. I think I'll move on. Thank you so much to the witnesses.
Thanks for that. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know we're in the middle of a very important emergency study on northern cod, and Mr. Kellaway continues to say that on this side of the table we're trying to dodge the Fisheries Act. But just for the record, Mr. Chair, Mr. Morrissey's motion was made in February of 2024 to conduct the study of the Fisheries Act following the study of the abandoned and wrecked vessels study. So Mr. Kellaway needs to take that up with Mr. Morrissey, because Mr. Morrissey's motion indicated that that side wanted to have that study after the wrecked and abandoned vessel study, Mr. Chair. So it'll happen. So to Mr. Burns, getting back to where we were a little earlier in the meeting about a stewardship fishery and at what point a stewardship fishery is actually a commercial fishery, or how much longer we could have pushed our stewardship fishery and to what level before we had serious pushback from NAFO. Is there anything that states that offshore vessels wouldn't be able to take part in a scientific research fishery inside the parameters of a stewardship fishery, Mr. Burns?
So there's no specific policy that defines what a stewardship fishery is. It was a unique approach that was applied specifically to the 2J3KL northern cod fishery. That said, it would be very atypical to not have a commercial fishery on a stock in the cautious zone, and indeed, at the NAFO annual meeting this fall, those comments were made around the table by some contracting parties related to the management of other stocks where there was debate about a moratorium, but the stock was in the cautious zone, and so a similar debate was had on a stock that was entirely NAFO managed.
So you stated earlier that a typical fishery for northern cod back in the day was around 500,000 tons. Is that correct?
I think that was one of the higher levels. I don't know that it would be necessarily typical, but it was as much as 500,000 tons, correct.
That was basically what you said there in your opening statement. So the difference between, 18,000 tons and 500,000 tons is it's quite a difference. How far into the cautious zone are we? Are we still close to the critical zone, or are we closer to the healthy zone?
So my colleague Bernard Vigneault can speak to that as well, but I can tell you that we don't have an upper stock reference point for this stock. So there is no healthy zone defined at this time for the stock, and so it's not really possible to say where in the cautious zone the stock is.
So would you say we've come a long ways from the critical zone at this point?
So certainly the framework assessment that was done in the fall adjusted the limit reference point. So it essentially lowered the limit reference point based, as my colleague noted, based on further evidence about the level from which the stocks continue to have productivity to rebuild. And the stock has been stable since 2016. So certainly we continue to have concern about the stock, which is why we have put in place strong measures to protect the stock within the Canadian fishery, and also negotiated those strong measures at NAFO to continue protecting the stock to ensure that it will continue to grow in the coming years to further increase the economic benefits that would flow to the harvesting sector.
So we talked earlier about the pressure from NAFO, which was basically non-existent to flip this fishery from a stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery. So it seems a bit hypothetical, the response that you gave to Mr. Morrissey, that we'd be faced with having to cough up the 5% to NAFO. Why would you think that NAFO would automatically jump in and say, we're going to have that 5% whether you give it to us or not? It's basically kind of how you put it.
So NAFO decisions are taken by the 13 contracting parties. And so what I can tell you is that it would be very atypical to not have a commercial fishery on a stock in the cautious zone like northern cod is. And NAFO would have the jurisdiction to establish whatever harvesting levels it wanted to, were Canada not to be cooperating at the table and negotiating strong measures. And that was our objective, was to ensure that the NAFO measures in place were robust in terms of limiting the harvesting potential for other contracting parties and ensuring that conservation measures consistent with the Canadian measures as the manager of this stock were in place.
Thank you, Mr. Small. A little over a minute over, but I'll get that back at the next meeting. Mr. Morrissey, 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just in listening to most of all the testimony given today, I have a question on, would we have been able to achieve from NAFO a reduced size of commercial cod without disagreement?
No, without Canada negotiating with contracting parties, the measures that have been achieved would not have been.
You reduced the size, right? No,
increased the minimum size.
You increased the minimum size.
Correct.
As well, so tell us the impact of also putting a seasonal closure on. What those two measures do for the overall resource.
So Canada succeeded at having Canadian conservation measures implemented within the NAFO regulatory area as well, and that
on this particular species, on this particular zone?
I believe so, and certainly I wasn't around the table 30 years ago when it was last managed by NAFO, but certainly this was a successful experience where we succeeded at having those Canadian measures implemented. And so without Canada's participation in that discussion and negotiation, the minimum size the gear requirements, the fishery closure, which is based on the best available data. It is based on data from the previous commercial fishery in the 90s, but it is intended to close an area we believe to be a sensitive area from a conservation perspective, and so contracting parties have agreed for that closure to be applied in the NAFO zone as well.
And how long will this be in place?
So it's the closures from April 15th to June 30th.
No, but this particular agreement with this new increased size and seasonal closures.
So that will be discussed each year as data improves in terms of knowing exactly when these closures should.
Is it fair to say it'll be the basis going forward of?
Correct. A similar closure is in place in 3M cod at NAFO, and it too is renewed each year, but it is a routine element of the decisions to renew it. So now that it's in place, it obviously makes it easier to maintain.
So from a person, and I watch it from the inshore, but looking at the offshore, I would come to the conclusion that the minister negotiated very well on behalf of the Canadian fishery as it relates to a difficult environment dealing with international partners. So to use your words, Canada secured a number of significant wins in the overall global management of this key resource off of Canada's east coast. So that would tell me then that the ministry and the minister negotiated very well on behalf of Canadian fishers. You reference the increased quota to the inshore, right? Correct? Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
The inshore quota for this year is 83.73%, which
and how does that compare to last year?
It's 15,000 and change, so that's about 2,000 tons more than what was available last year in the 13,000-ton stewardship fishery.
And that was paramount to the whole decisions around the management of this important resource going forward?
I'm not sure I follow that.
Well, you increase. So what we've been discussing, because how this arrived is that Canada it was left the impression Canada gave more access to the offshore, which is not the case, correct?
So the quota key gives the offshore 6%, but certainly the available quota, the quantum of fish available to the inshore this year is about 2,000 tons higher than it was last year.
Is that significant? Because again, we're using, is that significant above for the inshore above the offshore?
I understand your question. Yeah, the offshore, the quantum of fish available to the offshore this year is just over 1,000 tons, and the increase to the inshore is, I believe, just over 2,000 tons.
Okay. So the decision was weighed heavily towards the inshore. And at the same time, the decision and the data that went into the decision-making process secured significant key wins for the overall management of this northeastern resource off of Newfoundland for Canada. So thank you for your very good testimony today, Mr. Burns. I believe my time is
Thank you,
over.
Mr. Morrissey, and that kind of concludes the meeting. I want to say thank you to Mr. Burns, Mr. Vigneault, and of course Mr. McGilvery for joining us online and sharing their knowledge of this particular study that the committee has undertaken. If members got a minute, I'd just like to have a moment to say something when our witnesses are gone. I know we all have somewhere to be, but I'll be quick. Yeah. So much I can say to that. No, I just wanted to comment on the way the committee is acting or behaving or doing various studies. I've been on this committee now almost 9 years, and there's other members here who have been here as well. But it seems now that it's gotten to a point that it's almost political jabs back and forth. Instead of dealing with the study at hand and getting the information we want to be able to present a good report back to the House of Commons. It's, you know, smack for smack, I suppose, whether it's the Liberals taking a smack at the Conservatives or the Conservatives taking a smack at the Liberals.
The NDP take their share too.
Oh, who?
The NDP.
Not as bad, and you're the best. So, but I just think it takes away. Yeah. It takes away, I think, from what we're trying to do. And even when there's witnesses in the room, they must sit back and think, geez, they're like youngsters singing out at one another. It's like kindergarten. And I would like members to take that under advisement, to try and leave the political part of it outside these two doors, if we can. It'll make the committee run, I think, a lot better, a lot smoother, and give a better report back to the House at the end of the day.
Very fair, Chair.
Meeting adjourned. I want to thank our clerk and our analyst and everyone that made this meeting a success today. Meeting adjourned.
I just got here.
You were asleep, sure, through it all.